Thanks for coming along tonight, where Kate Grenville makes a welcome return to the Sydney Institute. She's been here as a speaker before and she's been in the audience before, but tonight back as a speaker. Look, she's one of Australia's finest and best known writers, so she's written, among other works, The Secret River, Elizabeth MacArthur's Letters, Sandy Thornhill, and of One Life, My Mother's... What's the story? I left the Y off. No, it's terrible. Anyway, so tonight we're here on the occasion of the release of Kate Grenville's most recent book, Restless, Dolly, Maunder, and as I said, there are signed copies here, which you can get after the event, or those on Zoom or later on our website and on YouTube can order from the Sydney Institute. But for tonight, Kate Grenville, Restless, Dolly, Maunder, here we go.
Thank you very much, Gerard. My gosh, you are so punctual. It is exactly 6 o'clock. I'm very impressed. So I've got my watch there, so I will not go over time. It's wonderful to be here again. I have been here several times talking, and several times also as an audience. The last time, in fact, I think perhaps the last time I was here was to hear my father talk about his book. Now, my father was a complicated man. In his youth, as somebody recommended, he was a communist. In fact, he was a Trotskyite revolutionary. And as the same person, who was it who said, you know, you should be a communist when you're young and a blah, blah, blah when you're older? I've forgotten. But anyway, Dad did that classic journey. By his later years, he was extremely conservative. But I was here to watch him launch his memoirs about his days as a Trotskyite revolutionary. Yes, it was a wonderful moment. Gerard reminded me that they had set up, he was maybe 92 at the time, so he was a frail old man then, a Kenneth G-E-E. So Gerard had very kindly set up a comfortable chair and so on and so forth. Dad said, no, I don't need any of that. So he stood up, only slightly tottery, and he gave his speech, but at the end of it, Bob Gould, you know, who used to run the Left bookshop in Newtown, stood up from the back and heckled him, quite rudely, saying that he'd, you know, only been a revolutionary for 3 minutes, so, you know, he should hang his head in shame and certainly not make money out of selling a book about it. I have mined my family for many of my books, and this is all because my mother was fabulously aware, I think, of the place of an ordinary family like ours in the big history of things. So she wrote down in her own memoirs a whole lot of stuff about our family, going right back to the convict ancestor Solomon Wiseman. So I've written my book, The Secret River, takes its inspiration from Solomon Wiseman in many ways. Sarah Thornhill is about Solomon Wiseman's daughter. One Life, My Mother's Story, is obviously about my mother. And this book is about my grandmother. So somebody said to me the other day, well, you'll have to start on the men next. What about your father? But of course, he's already got there first. So Dad was, he was a good writer, and he was also a good son-in-law, because of course he was Dolly Maunder's son-in-law. And the reason I say that is my grandmother was, she came to live with us when I was about 6, and Dad was unfailingly courteous to this old lady who came to live with us. Not every son-in-law would be as nice as I think Dad was to Dolly. The thing about Dolly, well, let me go back a step. The thing about grannies is they're supposed to be warm, cosy, cuddly people, slightly overweight, in a big flowery apron, coming at you with a plate of scones. Now, my grandmother was a thin, wrinkly, twig-like, stern, cranky old thing. She was the absolute opposite of the stereotype. And since I've been telling people, oh, I'm writing a book about my grandmother, or based on my grandmother, and she was a cranky old grandmother, so many people have said to me, oh, mine was too. So I'm just interested in every talk that I give, I ask for a little show of hands. How many people in this room had grandmothers who were cranky rather than the scone proffering stereotype? Okay. Oh, yes, quite a few. So I think we need to do something about the stereotype of grannies and somewhat broaden the picture of what they can be. So I knew quite a lot about Mum from her memoirs, and through her I knew a lot about my grandmother, because my grandmother obviously had a big effect on my mother's life. And Mum was obsessed with the fact that her mother didn't love her. On her deathbed, my mother said, "Why did my mother never love me?" And the stories she told about Grandma were of this cold, bullying, even slightly unhinged woman. So when I myself became a grandmother, which happened about 3 years ago, I found myself starting to think about Grandma. And I thought, well, now what would have happened? Grandma did not emerge out of her mother's womb as a cranky bully. Something made her that way. I start every book with a question, and the question with this book was, what made that woman turn into the very difficult and obviously unhappy person that she was at the end of her life? So one of the reasons is in where and when she was born and in what sort of social milieu. So I thought I would just write a tiny bit to give you the impression of what her beginning was. She was born in 1881 in Currabubula, which is a tiny town near Tamworth in New South Wales. As soon as she could walk, she knew she wanted to be outside, moving. The house was too dark, too small, smelling of stale wood smoke and dogs. It was outside she wanted, the horizon shaped by the perfect cone of Durai Mountain on one side and the high, ragged outcrop of Terrible Billy on the other. Outside and moving around. The sky above you and the dirt under your feet, and always the shape of the land against the sky, like a familiar face. They were 6 miles out of Currabubula, 3 dusty streets and a pub, and she was 5 before she saw a town, because Tamworth was 20 miles away and the Maunders didn't have much call to go there. In Dolly's childhood, there was before Willie and after Willie. He was killed off a horse one morning, leaned down from the saddle to open the gate, the same way he'd done 100 times. But the horse was fresh and bucked and threw him against the gatepost, and then trampled his head with clumsy great iron hooves. The blood balled on the dust, glittering in the early sun. Dolly ran out with the rest and saw, and the flies coming to it as quickly as if they'd been waiting. In all the years after Willie, Dolly never saw her mother smile, only go about the endless tasks, banging open the stove door to throw in more wood and clanging it shut as if to punish it. Her father, Thomas Maunder, had been brought out from London as a poor Cockney boy to work on the huge sheep run near Curra called Gunnaganoo. It gave him a special bitter satisfaction to go over and over the story of his humiliations there. He told over the hurts like jewels, turning them in his memory so they flashed with his anger. But he'd worked hard, boasted that in his younger days he'd held the shearing record in the area, 222 sheep in a single day with the blades. Yes, quite considerable. And finally got his own place, where they were now, Forest Farm. Dolly never saw anything soft in her father. When he came in from the paddocks, he filled the kitchen, massive, solid, a great rock. Sat at the head of the table, his big, rough hands flat on the wood, waiting for his tea to be put down in front of him, and woe betide if it wasn't ready when he was. Now and again, though, at the end of a long day of shearing or getting the hay in, there'd be moments of rough warmth between the father and his sons, Dolly's brothers. They'd all gone together at some mountain of work and beaten it, and one of them would say something over the stew that made the others laugh, something that had happened in the shearing shed or the paddock. But it was only for the pleasure of the men. They weren't going to explain the joke to the women. Girls were of no account. You learned that early on. Good enough to make the bread and milk the cow, and later on you'd look after the children. But no woman was ever going to be part of the real business of the world. So that, in a way, is the shorthand of why Dolly was the way she was. She was born the wrong gender, at the wrong time, in the wrong sort of social class. And her life would have been like her mother's, banging the stove door open, heaving the washing around and endless children, except that an amazing thing happened the year after Dolly was born, which is that some men in Macquarie Street, just up here, passed a law that said every child between 5 and 14 had to go to school. It was to be free, secular, and most importantly, compulsory. Dolly's father would have depended on his children for their labour. Quite young children make good shepherds. But Dolly got those few years of education because of the men in Macquarie Street. That means that when the farm failed, she married, and she and her husband had a farm, and when that farm failed, the fact that she and her husband had just that little smear of education meant that they could leave the farm and go into business. The first business they had was a little grocery shop in Wahroonga. I've often driven up there and tried to work out which of those funny little facades it might be. But Dolly could see that you could do better than a tiny little grocery shop in Wahroonga. She started a boarding house. She ran the boarding house. Her husband kept the shop going. And then they went into pubs. And like many people of their generation, they saw that buying and selling pubs, especially in the country, was the way to get a thing that would never have ever come to them otherwise, capital. They could start a business and just, have the income from it. But what Dolly could see was that if you bought and sold, you would actually get lumps of capital each time. She was the ultimate entrepreneur. And thanks to her drive and intelligence and kind of restless fury at the world, really, she was the one who made sure that they made a lot of money, which I might add they lost in the Depression, unfortunately. So that meant that Dolly, she'd grown up in this narrow, constricted little world, suddenly, because of the miracle of education, she could get out, she could escape. She otherwise would have been condemned to a life, as every woman of her generation was, of incredible injustice. Just because you're a woman, you couldn't do really anything that was interesting. You couldn't even wear clothes that you could actually move in. So she was saved from that. And she could see that she wanted to do even better for her own daughter. She could see that what had saved her life really was business, and she was going to make sure that her daughter also had that kind of opportunity. They had a difficult relationship. I can see that Dolly must have been a really difficult mother. In my worst moments, thinking back to myself as a mother with my daughter, I, beat myself up, as perhaps we all do, or perhaps we don't. I do anyway. All the things I've done wrong there. But I think sometimes a mother has to do something that's unpopular, and Dolly certainly did. My mother wanted to be a teacher. She loved poetry, art, all that stuff. But Grandma could see that there was something better these days for women, and she would force her daughter, really, to do pharmacy. I should go back a step and say that probably one of the great traumas, there were two great traumas in Dolly's life. One of them, I won't spoil the surprise if you read the book. It's to do with her husband and a secret that her husband had. But the other is to do with what happened when she was 14. She left school at 14, as everybody had to. She went home and she said to her father, I want to learn to be a teacher. I want to be a pupil teacher, which was the way you then learnt to be a teacher. And her father slapped his hand on the table and said, over my dead body, any daughter of mine goes out to work. For the reason that it would shame him. People would think he couldn't earn enough to keep his family. Now, I think that was a wound that Dolly carried with her all her life. And so when she bullied her daughter into doing pharmacy, it was for her own good. She could see that pharmacy offered, first of all, there was no marriage bar in pharmacy. You didn't have to leave when you got married, which most other jobs you had to. And it was a business. You were not working for somebody. You could have your own business. Even a woman could have her own pharmacy business, which in fact my mother did. But on the way to that kind of happy ending, Dolly and my mother had a very difficult relationship but it also had its moments of warmth. I think what I was always trying to do was to look behind Mum's idea of her mother. Mum had this stereotype of her mother as this sort of nasty person. I had a feeling that there was more to it than that, or something else. There was a much more complicated set of things. And in writing this book, I think I was trying to find it. Let's not judge this woman. Let's try and understand her. So I wrote this scene here, which is where Dolly and her daughter actually have a moment of closeness. It was a very rare one, but my mother told me this story, and so I used it to try and get into the psychology of this otherwise sort of unreadable old woman. The first hotel they had was called the Crown in Camden, and it's actually still there, looking rather nice these days. So that was their first pub. Next door to the Crown, there was a hall with a roller skating rink. Frank and Nance were heading off there one day with their sixpences when Nance suddenly turned back to Dolly and said, "Come on, Mum, come with us, I dare you." Cheeky, but apprehensive too. Dolly knew in a flare of understanding that it was just how she'd watched her own mother and father, that mix of love and fear. She wasn't going to strap on skates, but she went in with them and leaned on the rail to watch. There they were, coming round, Frank and Nance hand in hand. She smiled at them through the crowd and saw Nance's face light up with a sudden surprised smile. She waited. There was some kind of chance being offered, some breaking of the hard habit between her and her daughter. And after a time, Nance skated over. "Frank's with Clive and the others," she said, and she didn't need to say, "They don't want a girl with them." She took off her skates and they went out into the cool under the trees. The afternoon sun was slanting across, so there was a long, wobbly line of fence drawn in shadow on the grass, and for once a companionable feeling between mother and daughter. "Want a pair, Mum?" Nance asked. She didn't wait for Dolly to answer, was shimmying up the old tree like a monkey. Dolly could see her brown legs all the way up to her bloomers. Opened her mouth to say, "Get down this minute, Nance. There you are, showing the world your bloomers," but shut it again. That was what you were supposed to say, to stop a girl doing anything lively. But if Nance wanted to climb the tree and get her mother a pair, well, what was wrong with a girl's legs? They stood there together with the pear juice running down their chins, a big smudge on Nance's face where pear juice and dirt had stuck. She's got plenty of go in her, Dolly thought, and for once she felt tender towards this difficult girl. Still, there was a rueful edge to the tenderness. Here the child was, happy in her skin, no idea of what was ahead of her, the battles ahead of any girl. Could she protect her, give her the armour she'd need? Nothing in her own life showed her what a mother might do for a daughter. She'd have to make it up as she went along. And like most of us, she got it right sometimes and got it right the other times. Now, I know that Mum climbed that pear tree outside the Crown in Camden, got the pear. It was very juicy, she said. I know that happened because Mum told me. So that was the fact. But of course, what I didn't know, and I sort of knew what my mother felt about it, she said, I remembered that because it was one of the rare moments when Mum was nice to me. What I didn't know, though, was Dolly's side of that. I didn't know what Dolly thought and felt, not just about that moment, but about any of the injustices and delights, too, of her life. I had to imagine all that, which is why this is called a novel. You know, publishers, the whole publishing industry is so old-fashioned. A book has to be either fiction or non-fiction for the metadata. This book obviously plays in the grey. It's obviously a bit of both. And I thought that was legitimate because women like my grandmother, born in a poor family with minimal education, they are one of the many silenced groups in our past, and yet they were the majority. You know, it was only wealthier women who had the leisure to sit down and write their memoirs or their letters or their journals, or to sort of agonise about which man to marry. Women like my grandmother, had very little choice about any of that, and they left nothing of themselves behind, except, well, I've got a silver-plated teapot engraved by her friends when she left Gunnedah. And I've got an astonishing red velvet, I think she would have called it a costume. It's a suit. And when I look at the sleeves, they're about that big. I mean, there's no way any modern person could get into it. But apart from that, I have nothing of hers. She has been silenced. And those women will go on being silenced unless somebody's prepared to go in and kind of try to imagine what they thought and felt. My feeling was, yes, they look like another species in those old photographs, trussed up in those incredible clothes. We can't imagine what it must have been like, but actually they can't have been that different from us. They also must have felt, this is so unjust, so frustrating. Why, because of an accident of you know, the plumbing on my body, am I condemned to this life where I should be having this other life? So that's why I thought it was okay to step into Grandma's head and do my best to imagine what she might have thought. The other thing about Dolly is that she does represent not just her own story, but the reason I thought this book was worth writing, but the story of hundreds of thousands of women like her whose lives were transformed, actually, after the 1880 Public Instruction Act, but who still had to struggle. In 1890 or 1900, the doors were just starting to creak open for women. You know, the first few women were creeping to university, getting a few professions. Things were just starting to happen. I think contraception was just about starting to happen in, you know, again, for women with a bit of money. But what Dolly's whole generation had to do was to get in there and elbow those doors wider so that their daughters could go through. Now, the research, I didn't have much from Dolly. I did have the teapot and the amazing costume. I also found her in Trove. Any of you who've done family stories would have found Trove. And I found a wonderful bit where she goes to the local dance in Currabubula, and the bloke describes her frock. Miss Dolly Maunder, who was attired in a white flowered silk, trimmed with white silk lace and blush roses. Suddenly, my grandmother became alive. There she was, a probably not bad-looking young woman in a white flowered silk, trimmed with white silk lace. So suddenly, she was real. A woman who, you know, cared about what she wore and so on and so forth. There were some other things too. When they moved from the farm to Wahroonga, I was very exercised in my mind about what the difference would have been. Did they, for example, have reticulated water in Wahroonga in 1918? Did they have gas? What did they use? Did they have long drops in the backyard, or what was the business about, you know, how did they get rid of their excrement? Well, the Wahroonga Library gave me the information that, yes, she would have had a gas stove. Now, that would have been an incredible freedom for a woman who, up till then, if you wanted as much as a cup of tea, you would have had to, you know, clean the ashes out, find the kindling, get some man to have sawn up the wood, blah, 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 go out and pump the water out of the tank. She could just, you know, flick it on at the turn of a switch and the flick of a match, she would have that cup of tea. And for the first time, there wasn't a long drop in the backyard. There was a poor unfortunate man, the dunny man, who came round a couple of times a week. I think it was threepence. He would come and empty one pan and replace it with a clean one. So the research that I did for this book made my grandmother's life real in a way that, you know, it is very difficult. It was difficult even with all that research. I felt, though, that I felt a bit like, you know, those scientists who try to reintroduce some almost extinct species into a particular ecosystem. You know, they take it away and they breed it up, and then they come back and they let this little creature out. It sticks its nose out and then it disappears into the bushes. I felt I was kind of doing that with my grandmother and her whole generation of women. They are an important part of, if you like, the ecosystem of the past, and yet they have been they're almost extinct. So things like this are an attempt to bring them back. So I have one vivid memory of my grandmother, which I meant to tell you at the beginning, but I'll tell you now. I was about 6 and she had come to live with us, and I was playing in the backyard basically moving dirt. That was my favourite activity. I think I wanted to be an archaeologist, although I wouldn't have known the word then. Anyway, Grandma came out of the little granny flat where she lived and she stood over me, and I remember this seemingly incredibly tall, thin, threatening, frowning person, and she looked down at me and she said, "Do you love me, Kathy?" And, well, I can only say I was a child who had been reared to be truthful. So I looked up at this rather alarming person and I said, "No." I can only say that I wish I had that moment back. I couldn't say, "Yes, Grandma, I love you," because that wouldn't be true. But now I would say, "Grandma, you are a strong, resilient, powerful woman. I admire you, I honour you, and I thank you for the fact that you kept pushing those doors open so that my mother had a better life than you did, and I, in my turn, have an even better life than my mother." And if I could speak to Mum, that poignant question that she asked me, why did my mother love you? Why did my mother never love me? I would say, actually, your mother did love you in the deepest way. She gave you the tools so that you could make a fabulous life for yourself. So we regret the past, don't we? But I urge all of you to write memoirs so that the past doesn't completely vanish. Thank you very much. That's all I'm going to say. Thanks.
Many thanks, Kate. So, as I said, copies of Kate's latest book, Restless, Dolly, Maunder, selling outside, and there's signed copies for after the event. So, right at the end, you've come back to where you were at the beginning as to, well, you haven't quite explained why your grandmother didn't love your mother, but you have explained what she did for her that was helpful. So why do you think she didn't like it? Did she like children? Did she like you?
That's a good question. Look, I think she, at a time when there was no effective contraception for a woman of her class and income, rather amazingly, she and Bert only had 3 children. So I can only say they must have figured something out. So I suspect she perhaps didn't like children all that much. The first 2 children, her first one, Frank, and then Nance, my mother, were born in quick succession, and they were both born. Don't want to be a spoiler and give away the big secret in this. I see some people they already know the secret. There was a terrible moment of betrayal when those 2 children were just tiny infants, and I think Dolly's relationship with them was kind of tainted by the betrayal that she felt. And then 3 or 4 years later, another child came along, Max, and by then the bitter feeling of betrayal and grief of that moment had passed, and she did very much love Max. My mother was actually, I think, very jealous of Max as being, the apple of their eye. As for whether she loved me, well, I think she did, because if you say to somebody, "Do you love me, Kathy?" You hope the answer will be yes, don't you? You want to feel love coming back, and that suggests that there's a certain amount of love coming out of you. I think I'm right about that. That psychologically makes sense, doesn't it?
So tell us, you had 2 brothers, right?
That's right, yes.
So what was your relationship with your brothers?
They're both older than I am. Chris is now dead, unfortunately, so I'm not able to ask him what his relationship with Grandma was. But my brother Stephen remembers her much better than I do. He's 7 years older than I am. He actually gave me many of the wonderful stories in here, including the fact that during and after the war, my grandmother had jobs in various places, often as a cook in a hospital, that kind of low-skill job, because she didn't have many skills. And her last job was at the Grand Australia Hotel, just up the road here, I think, was it in George Street or Pitt Street? Anyway, it was one of Sydney's poshest hotels, and it had a very posh ladies' bathroom. And my grandmother was given the job of looking after this bathroom, which involved, I do vaguely remember this from my childhood, you did your thing and then somebody would be standing there to hand you a little towel to wipe your hands with as if you were not capable, and you then put threepence in the saucer. Apparently, though, the real reason why my grandmother had been chosen for the job is that the person who'd interviewed her, the real reason for having anybody there was to keep the riffraff from coming in and using the facilities. And Steve said, well, you know, the guy who interviewed them would have looked at Grandma and thought, this old harridan will keep them out.
Kate, it's a great book, as always. But you capture her mind brilliantly, and you say you've got very little evidence, but you've got one piece of evidence which brought tears to my eyes, and that was the letter she wrote to Frank at the end. I can't spoil the story, but she says things in that letter that you can't imagine her saying if he was standing in front of her, and there's a bigger tragedy to all that. And to my way of thinking, she represents a whole generation that were not able to say, to emote, like we emote all the time now. Social media is just full of it. They were never taught to emote. Her parents never emoted. But in it, she was the one that drove all the upwardly socially mobile moments. She never could put her name on a deed. Husband did that, but husband was following her. So could you like to comment a little bit further on that strange combination?
She really was a complicated person. Yes, it's interesting that she sent my uncles to the best schools, to Newington here in Sydney and to the Armidale school when they went up to Armidale. She must have had a ferocious knowledge somehow without having had an education. She must have known that that was the key to giving her children a better life. She was, yeah, look, it's hard to, I think what you say about people not emoting is very true. It's partly the sort of British culture. My father actually spoke about that very thing in his own memoirs, that his father still referred to Britain as home, even though he had in fact never been there. And it was several generations since any G's had been born there. And Dad said it was a house of the stiff upper lip. I don't think I'm misquoting him. So I think it was partly a generational thing, but I also think when life is as miserable as Dolly's was in the beginning, before she found the way to her freedom, I think there's kind of no point in complaining. The stiff upper lip is the way to deal with things that are beyond your power to change, which Dolly was. She was born into this world that she had no power to change, and yet somehow the little tiny life raft of a speck of education was the thing that she grabbed and, you know, shot out of that world. She also married the right guy. My grandfather, Bert Russell, was the son of what we'd now call a single mother. I don't quite know her history, but I can only say this. She was married to a man called John Russell, and they had 2 daughters. But then John Russell seems to have disappeared. And Mary Russell then had a series of children, 8 actually, by, it seems, many different men. And over many of the birth certificates, which I sent away for, including my grandfather's, is the horrible word illegitimate, written all the way across the piece of paper so that no one would miss this shameful thing. So what that means is that my grandfather grew up in a house with a mother who was struggling to feed this endless stream of children that was coming along. And I think what that did for him was to say, women deserve a better deal. No one should have to live the way my mother is living. There should be something better, and these women should be honoured. So as a result of that, he wasn't one of those men who stood in Dolly's way when she wanted to do things. I think she was the instigator, definitely, and he would have occasionally said no. But on the whole, I think he thought, all right, she's the one with the brains, and he was clever too, but she had a kind of driven quality, which we all know about, don't we? We know people like that. She was the one that got it going. And the wonderful thing about Bert is he didn't stop her.
So let me know if you want to come in. So you mentioned your father, Ken G, who said that his father, although he hadn't been to Britain or England, whatever they called it then, regarded it as home. I guess it was England. Oh, it could have been Scotland. Britain. But I guess that's partly because he was a Protestant, right? Because if you came up in an Irish family, as I predominantly did, we never regarded England as home. I mean, I'm not sure where home was. I mean, home was in Australia, but it was... So tell us about the religious background. Were they at all religious? Were they just notional Protestants, or were they go to church, or what did your grandmother do? Do you know?
They were certainly notional Protestants, and one of Dolly's sisters had to marry a Catholic, got pregnant to him, basically, and that was kind of a terrible... It was not so much a shame. The shame wasn't about, getting pregnant out of wedlock. The shame was about, as I understand it, kind of moving from one tribe to another. You were born Catholic or you were born Protestant. If you were Protestant and you became Catholic, it was said that you turned, like a spy. It was almost a kind of moral thing. It was a ghastly thing, and I'm sure it was the other way around when Catholics went into Protestant households. I never saw any form of religion with my grandmother except after the war, when various tragedies happened and various people close to her died, not to give away too much of the story. In her belongings when she died was a worn old Bible, and in the letter that Anne mentions, which is verbatim, she does mention God. Thank God you are free, or some words to that effect. But my own feeling is that it would have been a kind of a token thing. I say in the book that church was just something you did. You went along, the Catholics went to their church, the Protestants went to theirs. You sang a few hymns, did a few prayers, and then you stood around gas-bagging. And then for the rest of the week, you were all in together. So I don't know whether that's true, but I think in a little tiny country town like Currabubula, it would have had to be.
My paternal grandfather was a Protestant, so I understand the issue a bit. Barry Humphries, looking at the John Howard's documentary he did on the Liberal Party, and Barry Humphries appears, and Barry says that his mother never spoke to her sister, that is his aunt. Hang on.
Yeah, that sounds right. Yep.
It was either he didn't speak to his aunt or the child ever again after the Protestant married the Catholic. Barry's mother never spoke to the person again. That's how bitter it was. Now, where are we, folks? So,
I'm a fifth generation Australian.
Right.
And my father always spoke of England as being home.
Right.
And I used to question him about this. I can't be, you should be in Australia. No, England is home. That's where we all came from. And it sort of stayed with me forever. So one was taught to have enormous respect for the Crown.
Yes, I suppose so. Look, Dad came from that background, but he rebelled against it. Dad was quite early on, I think, he rebelled against that whole genteel thing. After all, he married, a woman from a very modest background, my mother, and she was a pharmacist, which is not like being a doctor or a lawyer, even now. So I think it was a kind of snubbing his nose, actually, at that whole thing, part of his rejection of his family, I suppose. It is an odd thing, isn't it, to regard a country that you've never been to as home.
tell us about... Yes, sir.
No, I just want... How much of it is fiction, how much of it is fact? In her early days of what we'd call then courting, and she's nearly 30 when she marries, and some of that you don't realise the years are going past, but she has a couple of other suitors, as you might. Was that real, or did you invent them in order to show the way in which people chose a husband or got to marry? I mean, one was because of social reasons, one was because of religious reasons. They never came about, and then Bert, the guy who came to school without the shoes, ends up being the husband because he's mother's choice, not hers. Mm-hmm. And how much of that's true, and how much of it did you embroider for the sake of us understanding the whole picture?
Yes, that's a really good point, Anne, because I sort of had a foot in both worlds. On the one hand, I wanted to be faithful to the actual facts as far as I knew them, a sort of historian's punctiliousness. But on the other hand, I had the sort of novelist's recklessness of wanting to make it a story people would read, so that they would actually, I mean, if you don't read anything, you're not going to be sort of enlightened. So that was the dilemma I had. So I, like every Liberin, I found a way in between the middle, found a balance. The notion of the other suitors, some of them are real. The boy from Murrurundi, who was actually from a higher social class, that was real. My mother told me about that. And the Catholic boy, who was very much in love with her, that was also real. But the boy up in Dorrigo, who was a journalist, that was extrapolation from the fact that my grandmother was engaged to my grandfather at the age of 29, and her mother pushed her into it because she was 29. She was about to be left on the shelf. But Mum went to Dorrigo to visit a school friend, and Mum said she stayed and stayed and stayed, and they could not get her to come home. Now, one reason is that she probably was putting off the moment of actually marrying, but I thought, yes, but the other reason might be that she actually met someone up there who was not just a farmer who would promise kind of more of the same, a repetition of her mother's life. This young man from Dorrigo, he was from a timber getter family, but he wanted to be a journalist, and he was about to go to Sydney and write for the papers. So a whole glamorous, interesting, political, intellectual life was about to open up for this man, who I invented. But I think that there could well have been somebody like this. And definitely it had the effect of saying, as she said, she says at the end, Will Shaw went off to Sydney without proposing to Dolly. And she said, he's a man. He can go off to Sydney, he can go to a pub, cosy up next to somebody in a bar, and sooner or later someone will say, oh, why don't you come and work for me? I've got a job on a paper, come and work for me. Simply impossible for a woman, just because she was a woman.
I got a question earlier from a reader in Adelaide who's got your book.
Good.
You said 234, photograph
Ah, yes.
of your mother.
No, my grandmother.
I'm sorry, your grandmother. So tell us, it'll be hard to pick up on camera, but tell us what that tells you about her. You've got a little explanation underneath about, I think it came from your mother, he says, right?
The photograph, yes, there it is.
What does that tell you about? It's a strong face.
It's a strong face. It's the face on the cover. Now, I've looked at this. This is a classic photo, which every one of you will have in your photo albums. I know you can't see it very well, but you probably don't need to, because it is the classic cliche shot of the 19th century woman trussed up in an extraordinary garment, sitting on a chair with kind of columns and ferns and sort of grand stuff behind her. That is in every Australian's photo album, I suspect. What I looked at it for years and thought, how could you possibly, this person is not human. As I said, looks like another species. But one day, because of the miracle of computers, I just focused in on the face, which is the face on the cover. And I thought, this is a woman I could meet any day of the week. In fact, I could meet her in the mirror. This is a real person with a real inner life. This person is a kind of theatrical mask of a woman dressed up to look like a lady. My conviction, I don't think at this point, photograph was taken before Dolly married. She had no money. She would not have been able to afford that dress. And certainly all the trappings, the fancy columns and so on. I suspect that the photographer, as I've said in the commentary, the photographer supplied, I think, everything. The chair, the dress, the book that she's pretending to have just put down, certainly the columns in the background, and possibly she might even be wearing a wig. I'm not sure, but I have a feeling she might be. So it's like the only thing that is hers in that photograph is her face. Everything else is constricting her, trammeling her into this stereotype of a woman. You must match this image. This is all you can be, this little tiny, limited thing. Wouldn't it have been hideous? We are so lucky to be women born today and not then.
Question up the back.
I'll do without this. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I just wondered in the book whether you deal at all with climate. The reason I ask that is I come from a rural background on one side of my family for many generations. And one of the continuous factors in that family life was drought. And what it led to was a stoicism and a necessity of just dealing with events and a long patience. What that did not encourage, therefore, was emotional feeling or explosion, because that actually was deadly. And I've known in my own family, with both the men and women, particularly with the men, but also with the women, that tray is very strong, and I put much of it down to the climate.
Gosh, you're absolutely right. I had not thought of that, but you're absolutely right. Because if you get upset about it, you will, as so many people do, not cope, as people are doing now, committing suicide, because they actually, it's unbearable. So you're quite right. It develops that kind of strong stoicism. For the women, there's a kind of double helplessness. The men are at the mercy of the climate. The women are at the mercy of the climate and the mercy of the men making decisions about it. When Dolly and her husband first set up a farm, it was out at Gunnedah, which of course is where Dorothea McKellar was thinking of when she wrote, Love of Sunburnt Country, Land of Sweeping Plains, flooding of drought and flooding rains. It's a place of fabulously rich soil, but extreme climate, as you would know. Now, Mum used to say they didn't have a crop for 7 years. For 7 years, they planted the wheat, and either it was drought, flood, caterpillars, locusts, and the final year, the 7th year, she said they had this incredible crop, the ear bending over heavy with the wheat. And hail came the day before they were going to harvest. And it was the last straw for my grandmother. But instead of kind of buckling under it, as you might, that's when she apparently, my mother tells this story, she could remember it, she was 6, I think, her mother banging the saucepan on the stove, saying, we're going, we're not going to stay here anymore, we're going to go. So something in Dolly was not going to wait for that 8th year. But when they lived in Temora, which was a few years later, and they had a very grand pub there, someone in Temora said to her, yes, we sometimes don't get a crop for 3 or 4 years, but when we do, it's a bumper crop and it makes up for all the other years. And I think I put into my grandmother's mind the thing, what if we had got that crop in the 7th year? We would have stayed on the farm, and I would never have had these businesses, this life, this large kind of world-engaged life. Thanks for that observation. That's really interesting.
Tell us a bit about the Great Depression and that impact.
Okay, well, they bought and sold pubs for 7 years, but they never bought the freehold. They just got the licence and the lease. And when I looked at the records in the state archives, I noticed that they had every pub for exactly a year. So someone can probably tell me, but there was probably some capital gain tax, or there was some probably reason why, if you had a place for just under a year, it was to your advantage. But in 1928, they decided to buy the freehold of the grandest pub in Tamworth. Now, they'd both grown up very poor just outside Tamworth, and the freehold for the Caledonian Hotel came up for sale. And Mum said it was kind of the salmon returning thing. They wanted to go back and show people how well they'd done. So for the first time in their lives, they went into debt. They sold everything they had, and they went into debt to the tune of £10,000 or £12,000, I think, a vast amount in those days. And of course, because of the date, you know what happened next. Within a year, they were more or less bankrupt, undeclared bankrupts. And my grandfather, but even in that extreme case, my grandmother knew what to do. She said, all right, we'll turn the hotel into a boarding house, because people still need a place to live. We can pack people in, 3 or 4 to a room. I'll get back in the kitchen and make the meals and so on. And my grandfather said, over my dead body, you'll turn the Caledonian into a doss house. He was too proud to do that. So instead, they swapped the one property they still had, which was the one property that was in Dolly's name. She was determined to have a bit of property in her name, and she'd bought a block of flats in Roslyn Gardens in Potts Point. If only, if only we still had them. If only. So she swapped that for a farm at Mittagong because my grandfather said, at least you never go hungry on a farm. You can always grow something to eat and there are plenty of rabbits. So it must have been the most incredible humiliation and grief to leave the grand Caledonian and to go to this miserable farm. I went down to Mittagong to do some research, and there are some nice farms at Mittagong, but there are also some very stony, dry, high ridges, which is, I suspect, what my grandparents would have had. And there they weathered the Depression, but halfway through the Depression, Frank, who was my mother's older brother, heard about a ballot. I mean, they just had amazing initiative, these people. Heard about a ballot that the government was offering, land up in Queensland. You had to put £50 down to go in the ballot, and if you didn't win it, you got your money back. And otherwise, you got on this bit of land, which research told me had been overrun with prickly pear in the previous years, but they'd just got the Cactoblactus, if that's how you pronounce it, caterpillar, which had cleared off the prickly pear, and the government wanted to get people back onto this land. So my Uncle Frank, with great initiative, borrowed £50 from my mother, which was a lot of money, I think, in the Depression, and went in the ballot and won it. So this is a family where to have nothing is to take a step into the dark. Why not? Don't just, as she says, we won't just stay like tadpoles in a pond. We'll try and do something else. So the Depression was appalling for everybody, and it sort of showed them that there was no end. There was always something more you could do.
How's the New Caledonian going?
Oh, the Caledonian. Have any of you been to Tamworth recently? You might know then. The Caledonian was Tamworth's grandest hotel. I've seen photographs. It's like an ocean liner. It's this enormous thing with, iron lace and huge veranda, a beautiful place. It is now not even Kmart, it's the Kmart car park. It's absolutely tragic. I stood there one hot day looking around, standing on this bitumen, beating back the heat, the cars glittering around me. And I just thought, what have we done? What have we done in this country to demolish this magnificent place that my grandparents loved beyond anything? How do you happen to know about the Caledonian? Or did you read it already? Right. Okay.
He works up in Tamworth. He lived in Tamworth for a while and goes there to see friends, just to pick it up on the...
Right.
Yep.
What about the flats in Potts Point?
Oh. Yeah, if only. But if they'd hung onto the flats, I mean, as she said, all the tenants were in arrears, but you couldn't throw them out onto the street. And besides, nobody else had money either. There was no future in them. So eating a lot of bunny pie on the farm at Mittagong was probably a better option.
In a sense, people did have money. So you're talking about people totally in the private sector. But if you had a job in a Commonwealth or state government, you would have had your wage reduced by 10%. But we're in a period of deflation, not inflation, so your wage would have remained about the same. So anyone working on the railways, working as a teacher, working in a hospital, policeman, they did well in the Depression. But you've come from a family that really seems to have, the government's never really paid them anything, has it? Did they ever talk about that?
No, that's right. They are the ultimate free enterprise. You can make a lot of money in business, but when things go wrong, it's the public servants that survive. Look, I'm probably actually the first. Look, Mum was very briefly a state teacher, but other than that, I may be the first in the family ever to have worked for the government. I worked for a place called Film Australia for many years, which was a federal government filmmaking body. And yes, and my brother ended up at the Reserve Bank. But yes, this is not a family of public servants.
I think we're about to finish, Anne.
I was just going to say Ken was paid by the state, wasn't he?
Oh, that's true. When he was Crown Prosecutor, yes, that's true. But that was in his later years.
And Ken G became a judge later, but that's in his later years. That's and fondly remembered here, at the at the Sydney Institute. Good
As a
friend of
Trotskyite,
ours.
he would have been horrified.
Can I just say that it's an amazing thing you've done for your grandmother, because in so many ways it's the history of a generation.
Yes.
And when I was doing things on Enid Lines, every now and then a woman would pop up in Tasmania, like a woman who managed to run a pub in Devonport in 1903. I mean, there were these women that were quite strong. And to some extent, maybe Australia allowed them that freedom, which they wouldn't have got elsewhere. Did you think of any of that? Think of the
Yes,
the colony being a sort of place where it was a little bit razzle-dazzle, a little bit have a go if you can?
I think so. The gentility of the mother country could be left behind, and you didn't quite have to, match up to some of those stereotypes. You could make it up as you go along, and there was that sense that you were leaving the mother country further behind, so you could just make up your own rules, which I guess we're doing now in spades.
Just finally, you finish this. What's next?
Oh, well, I've got a couple of books on the desk. None of them are quite ready to sort of expose to the public gaze, I don't think, yet. They all seem mad to me, but every book that I write seems mad before it's like this. And I always say to my publisher, this is the last book I'm going to write. And I always have the one on the desk, which miraculously does turn into a book, so I hope there will be another one.
Many thanks.
Thank you very much.
So, as I said, copies of Restless, Dolly, Maunder are sort of a pre-mad book before it became something else. And the copies here tonight, and thanks for a wonderful talk tonight about your family, about Australian society 100 years ago or 100 years plus ago, coming forward to where we are today. Well done and good luck.
Thank you, Gerard.